A Flash in the Dark, Chapter 9, Remembering. Barry raced down the runway, the wind tearing at her hair and rushing past her face. She felt nearly invincible as she raced down the slightly cracked asphalt. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she spotted what looked like lightning. Suddenly, it was like she was back in that night, watching the lightning swirl around her living room, trapping her mother, who was yelling at her to run. Then she blinked and she was back on the testing track and racing straight for a large collection of barrels. She could do nothing but throw her arms up over her face to protect herself as she tried to skid to a stop. She crashed into the barrels, sending quite a few of them flying as a large plume of water flew to skyward. Barry felt something in her arms snap and screamed as she curled in on herself, her hand hanging at an odd angle. Caitlin raced over to her, glancing down at the iPad in her hands. Cisco was close behind, the two of them bundling her into the lab van. Barry glanced down at her arm, which was currently in a sling. It didn't hurt anymore, it just felt stiff. It had taken them an hour to get back to Star Labs with all the traffic on the road. They'd spent another 2 hours running tests. Finally, Caitlin approached her with her tablet. "It looks like you had a distal radius fracture," Caitlin said, showing her the x-ray they had taken. Barry nodded, then frowned. "Wait, had?" she asked. Caitlin flipped to the second x-ray. "It's healed. In 3 hours," Caitlin said, sounding like she barely believed it herself. Barry's eyebrows shot up. "How is that possible?" Barry asked. Caitlin frowned. "We don't know yet," Caitlin said. Cisco held up the helmet Barry had been wearing, which was cracked. "You really need to learn how to stop," he said. Barry forced a smile as Caitlin began to take off the sling. Dr. Wells drove his wheelchair closer to her. "What happened out there? You were moving pretty well, and then something caused you to lose focus?" Wells asked. Barry frowned down at her hands as she explained what had happened the night her mother died. She looked back up at Dr. Wells. "What if the man who killed my mother is like me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Dr. Wells shook his head. "I think I can say unequivocally, you are one of a kind, Barry Allen," Wells said, shaking his head. Barry nodded, a deep frown etched into her face. Her phone pinged from across the room, and she raced over to it without even thinking about it. She checked her texts as several papers blew around in her backdraft from her short run. It was a text from Iris. "Haven't heard from you in a bit. I know I'm hovering. Just worried about my sister." Barry smiled slightly as she turned back to the Star Labs crew. "I gotta get going. My sister's getting worried about me," Barry said, waving her phone slightly. Dr. Wells nodded. "Very well, then. We'll contact you when we've figured something out," Wells said, waving her out the door. Barry smiled and nodded. "Thanks." She grabbed her purse and rushed out of Star Labs, catching a taxi to Jitters. Leonard Snart sipped his coffee as he sat in the corner table at Jitters. He had been frequenting the coffee shop lately. He loved this town, even if things had gotten a bit weird over the past 9 months. He was very good at keeping under the radar. Besides, for the past 9 months, the city had been busy being mad at Dr. Harrison Wells to pay attention to him. He moved on, keeping a low profile, casing jobs, keeping an eye on the CCPD. They seemed almost depressed lately, like one of their own had been affected by recent events, but it wasn't a cop, so he didn't pay too much attention to it. He glanced up as the door opened. The girl who walked in was pretty, with brown hair nearly down to her ass and sparkling hazel eyes. She came into the coffee shop with one of the waitresses, the one who'd been kissing Detective Thawne moments earlier. Pink lips quirked up slightly as she and the cop's girl had what seemed to be a good-natured argument. It was easy to beat her to the counter. "I'll have another Americano, no room, and whatever she wants." He gestured over his shoulder to the pretty brunette. The blonde behind the counter grinned and nodded. He slipped a 50 across the counter. "You tell me your name and you can keep the change." The blonde's smile widened. Her name is Barry Allen. She is such a sweetheart, Iris's foster sister, the barista said with a grin. Leonard raised an eyebrow. Who's Iris? Leonard asked. The blonde pointed at the girl next to Barry. One of my best workers. Also very protective of her sister, as she should be. Barry just woke up from a 9-month coma, the barista explained. Leonard raised an eyebrow, then nodded before heading back to his table. It wasn't long before Barry made her way up to the counter. She placed her order and reached for her wallet. The blonde shook her head and motioned toward Leonard. He raised his cup in a mock salute, and Barry blushed. She really was quite pretty. She smiled lightly as she was handed her coffee cup and made her way toward him. Thanks for the coffee. She was still blushing and looked a little nervous, but that just made Len grin wider. Not a problem at all. You looked like you were having a bad day. Pretty girl like you shouldn't have bad days, he said smoothly. The blush grew darker. Thank you. It's been a pretty interesting day, she said, running her hand through her hair. Iris cleared her throat behind Barry, who glanced back. I have to go, but thanks. Barry paused and snatched a napkin off the table, jotting down her number on it before smiling one more time and leaving with her sister. Len took the napkin and tucked it into his pocket. He'd have to save it for a rainy day. He smiled as he left the coffee shop.